The Mississippi Delta was a land where silence seemed to breathe. By day, cicadas sang in shrill chorus, and the riverboats groaned along the wide brown waters. But by night, stillness fell heavy, like ash settling after a fire. That silence was never empty. It carried the weight of whispers, whispers that wrapped around the cypress trees and clung to the broken fences of Whitlock Plantation. They spoke of cruelty, of power wielded like a whip, and of a man whose pride grew larger than his harvest. His name was James Whitlock. James was not born with a crown, but he wore one all the same. He walked with the certainty of ownership, his boots crushing soil as if it belonged to him alone, his voice sharp enough to bend men and women into silence. To him, the land was his kingdom, and every soul who worked at a piece of his inheritance. He smiled only at his own reflection, finding in it the mark of triumph, the assurance that he could take and keep and break at will. Among those bound to him was Eliza. She was not born free. She was not raised to dream of the wide horizon that hung so close but so unreachable across the Delta skies. Her days were spent in labor and quiet obedience, her nights in weary silence. Yet she carried herself differently from the others. Not rebellious, not loud, but with a stillness so deep it unsettled those who looked too long. She moved like a shadow across the fields, her face turned away from the whip, her lips sealed tight as though speech itself had been stolen from her. The villagers spoke of her in hushed voices, careful not to let James hear. They said she was like a ghost walking in daylight, her eyes hollow yet luminous, carrying sorrow that could not be named. Some swore the cypress trees bent low when she passed beneath them, their moss-draped arms reaching down as though to touch her. Others whispered that silence like hers was dangerous, for silence had the power to turn into something else, something sharp, something final. At Whitlock Plantation, silence was not just the absence of sound. It was a presence heavy and alive. It pressed against the wooden walls, seeped through the cracks of the shutters, and lingered at the edge of every meal. And beneath that silence, a story was beginning to stir, one that would not end in whispers. It would end in screams and in legend. The wedding was no celebration. It was a sentence written in lace. James Whitlock declared it with the authority of a king, summoning neighbors and kin to the grand hall as if it were a coronation. He demanded a bride, not of choice or love, but of conquest. And so they brought Eliza forward, draped in borrowed lace, the fabric thin and frayed, smelling faintly of moth and ash. She stood in the center of the room like a candle in a storm, her wrists trembling though no rope bound them. Every eye followed her, but none dared to meet her gaze for long. It was not beauty alone that silenced the hall. It was the heaviness of her stillness, the kind that spoke of chains no hand could see. The candles sputtered in their iron holders, casting long shadows that bent across the walls like reaching fingers. Guests shifted uneasily in their polished shoes, their whispers dying in their throats. They saw not a bride, but a prisoner paraded before them, her silence louder than the organ's dirge. The lace upon her shoulders looked less like bridal cloth and more like a burial shroud, thin and pale against her skin. A hush lingered, broken only by James's laughter, sharp and jagged, slicing through the air with pride. He was swollen with triumph, mistaking fear for reverence, obedience for devotion. He reached for her arm, his fingers heavy and possessive, and the hall seemed to tilt with his arrogance. He lifted her hand as though it were a trophy, showing her to the crowd like one might a jewel pried from the earth. Yet even in that grip, her silence did not break. Her lips pressed together, her breath shallow, her eyes lowered, but not in surrender. Beneath the stillness, something sharper stirred, unseen, waiting. The preacher's words fell like stones into water, heavy and cold, vanishing without echo. "Do you take this man?" But Eliza gave no answer. Her silence was her vow, and her vow was refusal. Still, the ritual was forced forward, James nodding with each declaration, dragging her into a covenant she never spoke. At last, When he leaned down to claim her lips before the congregation, she turned only slightly. Not enough to refuse, not enough to resist, just enough to deny him triumph. The hall froze. A single candle guttered out, smoke coiling like a spirit between them. James smirked, forcing her chin upward with a rough hand, planting his kiss as if stamping wax with a seal. The crowd exhaled as one, a sound half relief, half dread, for they knew this union was no blessing but an omen. And beneath the cypress trees outside, the wind carried a whisper, a bride not crowned but chained. The feast began as all feasts on Whitlock land did, with noise meant to drown out silence. Long tables sagged beneath roasted meats and gleaming silver platters, goblets brimming with red wine that spilled like blood when tipped too eagerly. The guests raised their cups, their laughter pitched high and false. Yet beneath it all lingered the weight of unease, heavy as storm clouds over the delta. The plantation walls shuddered with music and clatter, but the heart of the room lay still, watching. Eliza moved like a shadow among them, a bride in silence, bearing dishes from the kitchen as if she were not newly wed but still a servant bound to her place. Each plate she set before James was placed with careful grace, not trembling, not hurried, deliberate, ceremonial, as though she were laying offerings upon an altar of death. The light of the chandeliers caught her face in flashes, pale against the dark wood, her eyes cast down but not empty. Those who dared to look at her swore they glimpsed a storm locked tight behind her gaze, as if the delta's tempests themselves had found shelter within her chest. James reveled in the charade. His laughter roared over the music, crude and unrelenting, every gesture a reminder that he believed himself master not only of the land but of her silence. He clutched her wrist when she passed too quickly, pulling her close enough for the hall to see his grip, his fingers a brand of possession. He demanded she smile, demanded her lips curve to mirror his victory. But Eliza's mouth remained still, a line etched in stone. Her silence was her defiance, though none dared name it aloud. The guests averted their eyes. Some chewed with forced vigor, others sipped their wine to hide trembling hands. They knew what they witnessed was no marriage feast, but a theater of cruelty, each moment tightening like a noose. The musicians played faster, fiddles screeching like trapped birds, as though sound itself might break the spell that settled upon the room. James lifted his goblet high, wine dribbling down his chin, and mocked her with a toast. To my bride, so silent, so obedient, so mine. His words dripped with satisfaction. Yet in that moment, the air itself seemed to recoil. Eliza lowered her gaze, but the candle flames bent as if drawn toward her, flickering with restless hunger. And then came the stillness, a hush that swept the hall without warning, smothering laughter, dimming music, as though the house itself leaned in to listen. Eliza's silence had grown thick, suffocating, pressing against every chest until breath came shallow. The guests shifted, unease rippling like a current. None could explain it, but all felt it. The storm had not yet broken, but it was here, coiled inside her, waiting. The hall had emptied, laughter drowned by the weight of too much wine. The night staggered into silence, leaving Whitlock Manor restless, its walls swollen with secrets. Upstairs, in the chamber trimmed with velvet curtains and the scent of smoke, James Whitlock lurched toward the bed, drunk not only on drink, but on triumph. His boots scraped the floorboards, heavy and careless, while his hands fumbled at his coat, certain of what this night owed him. He called her name, not with tenderness, but with command, as though the word itself were a whip. Eliza obeyed, though not as he imagined. She entered the room with the quiet grace of a shadow slipping across stone. Her face betrayed nothing, no fear, no plea, no hint of the storm brewing within. She was carved marble, her silence her armor. Yet beneath that stillness, her breath ran sharp, cutting like winter air. James sprawled back against the bed, laughing into the dim candlelight, his voice slurred and ugly. He beckoned her with the arrogance of a man who mistook chains for vows. "Come," "Wife," he sneered, raising his glass before tossing it aside, where it shattered across the floor. He thought himself a king, seated upon his throne. He never saw the altar that room had become. On the table by the bedside, half hidden in the veil of shadow, lay a knife. Its edge was simple steel, meant for carving bread or fruit, but tonight it gleamed with an altogether different purpose. Eliza's hand hovered near it, deliberate yet unhurried, her fingers brushing its handle with the reverence of one touching sacred ground. The air tightened as she lifted it, the candlelight catching on the blade's silver skin. James laughed again, a deep, mocking sound, blind to the silence that coiled around him like smoke. "Still no words, my bride? Not a whisper for your master?" His arrogance filled the chamber, but the house itself seemed to grow still, listening. The floorboards groaned, the curtains stirred though the windows were closed, and the air grew so taut it threatened to snap. Eliza stepped closer, her shadow stretching long across the floor, joining his where he lay sprawled. She raised no voice, yet her silence spoke louder than any curse. In her stillness lay judgment, cold and unrelenting, as if centuries of sorrow had gathered behind her eyes. James reached for her, oblivious. He saw only what he had always seen: property, possession, obedience. But in the candle's wavering light, the blade gleamed brighter, patient, waiting. And in that breathless moment, when even the night itself seemed to hold its breath, Eliza stood over him, knife in hand. The silence had shifted. It was no longer submission. It was the calm before a storm that would tear his world apart. The silence broke not with words, but with steel. The blade flashed once in the dim candlelight, and then came the sound, a scream so raw, so animal, it shook the rafters of Whitlock Manor. James's cry split the night like a thunderclap, jagged and unholy, a man's pride torn open in an instant. He clutched himself, writhing, as blood spilled hot across the white sheets, blooming in violent roses that spread and spread until the bed itself seemed to drown in red. Eliza did not flinch. She stood above him, the knife still warm in her grip, her hand steady as stone. Her face bore no joy, no hatred, no triumph, only emptiness, the cold expression of judgment delivered. She had been silent all her life, but now her silence roared louder than his screams. She had broken the chains, not with words, but with flesh and blood. James writhed like a wounded beast, his voice cracking into pitiful whimpers. He clawed at the sheets, at the air, at her, but there was no strength left in his grip. The man who had called himself master, who had forced vows and mocked her stillness, was reduced to a shattered creature, undone by the very silence he once believed he owned. The room seemed to shift around them. The candles sputtered as if choking on the air, their flames bending toward her, feeding on the storm that had finally broken. The walls groaned, the floorboards trembled, and in every corner of the house, it was as though unseen eyes bore witness. This was not only an act of vengeance, it was the birth of something larger, something legend would one day whisper. Eliza dropped the knife. It landed with a soft thud upon the soaked sheets, swallowed by the sea of crimson. She stood unshaken, her gown heavy with stains, her chest rising and falling slow, deliberate calm. She looked down at him not as a wife, not as a slave, but as a figure beyond both, a specter carved from pain, carrying the weight of every silent scar. James's screams weakened into gasps, into ragged sobs that echoed pitifully against the chamber walls. His power, his pride, his legacy, all of it severed in one stroke. In that ruin, the master of Whitlock Plantation was no more. What remained was only a broken man, bleeding into the night. And standing above him, bathed in the shadows of her silence, Eliza became something else, not flesh alone, but myth beginning to breathe. For legends are born in blood, and hers had just taken its first breath. The scream did not stay caged within the chamber. It bled into the corridors, rolled down the stairwells, and spilled out into the night like fire racing through dry fields. Servants stirred from their beds, their eyes wide with dread, as James Whitlock's howl echoed across the plantation grounds. Not the roar of a master, but the broken wail of something less than a man. Dogs barked in frenzy, shutters rattled in their frames, and the house itself seemed to shake as though awakened by violence too great to contain. They rushed toward the chamber, lanterns flickering in trembling hands. Whispers rose first, sharp and frightened, before swelling into cries. Murder, sin, witchcraft. No one could bring themselves to open the door at first, for what lay behind it felt heavier than the night itself. When at last the latch gave way, they beheld the ruin. The master sprawled on his bed, drenched in blood, clutching himself with trembling fingers that could not hold back the tide. His face was pale, his mouth twisted in agony, the once proud voice reduced to a rasp. The sheets, once white as bone, were drenched crimson, dripping onto the floor in sluggish rivulets. And there, beside him, stood Eliza. Her dress clung to her body, dark and heavy, the stains of what she had done painting her like a martyr cloaked in scarlet. She did not tremble. She did not plead. Her silence was heavier now than ever before. A silence so thick it smothered the cries of the servants, silenced their gasps, pressed down on their chests until they struggled to breathe. She stood rooted, her eyes not on them, not even on James, but on something far beyond, as though she already belonged to another realm. Chaos ignited. Some screamed that she was the devil's bride, others that justice had finally found the master. A woman wept into her apron, crossing herself over and over. Men argued in harsh whispers, torn between fear of their master's wrath and awe at the woman who had dared to cut it from him. But Eliza did not move. Not when James's curses sputtered into the air, not when hands pointed at her like daggers, not when torches began to blaze. The chamber was no longer merely a room. It was an altar, the bed a tomb, and James Whitlock a sacrifice laid bare. Whitlock Manor would never sleep quietly again, for in that house, silence had risen up and blood had answered it. By dawn, the house had become a gathering ground. The night's terror had spilled into morning, and with it came the villagers, men, women, children, all drawn as though by some unseen current to the cypress grove that shadowed Whitlock Manor. Torches blazed though the sun had risen, their flames licking the pale daylight, as if fire itself wished to witness what was about to unfold. Eliza was dragged from the chamber, her hands bound, though she did not resist. Her bare feet left faint stains across the earth, every step a quiet mark of the storm she had unleashed. She stood beneath the trees, their long arms swaying like mourners, and faced the crowd with the same stillness she had carried through every cruelty. Her silence was a shield, and though her body was bound, her spirit remained untouchable. James was wheeled into the yard, pale as death, his frame hunched and broken. He spat curses, his voice ragged, calling her devil, witch, whore, demon. The words frothed from his lips like venom, but they carried no weight now. The crowd heard only the pitiful shriek of a man stripped of power, his pride severed in the night. His face twisted with hatred, yet beneath it lurked something worse, fear. The villagers shifted, uncertain, torn between horror and awe. Some muttered prayers, their eyes lowered. Others whispered that she was no demon but justice itself, justice cloaked in silence, justice that had bled into the sheets of Whitlock Manor. Children clutched their mother's skirts, peeking wide-eyed at the woman who had unmade their master with a single stroke. A makeshift circle formed, bodies pressing inward. The torches hissed and cracked, the flames spitting as if impatient for judgment. Some cried for her to burn. Others called for hanging. A few, braver or more haunted, whispered that she should be set free, that chains could no longer hold what she had become. Eliza did not speak. She did not beg. She did not weep. Her gaze did not fall on James, not even once. Instead, she lifted her eyes to the horizon, where the river shimmered faintly beneath the early sun. It was not escape she sought, but something deeper, a place beyond judgment, beyond cruelty, where silence could rest. The crowd murmured louder, their voices blending into a single restless growl. Torches swayed like stars ready to fall. The air thickened with verdicts unspoken, with rage and reverence colliding. And there she stood, unflinching, as though she already knew, no matter what they decided, her silence would outlive them all. What became of Eliza, no one truly knows. Some say the crowd buried her beneath the cotton fields, the soil swallowing her slowly, feeding the very plants she had tended in silence. Others swear they saw her move into the swamps, her gown trailing blood and dew, her feet leaving no mark, her presence carried on the mist that hugged the delta like a ghostly shroud. In every telling, she became more than flesh, a shadow that lingered, a whisper that haunted the edges of memory, a silence heavier than grief. James Whitlock lived, though he was never whole again, mocked by children as the severed man. His nights became filled with fevered dreams and screams he could not control. Every gust of wind through the cypress trees rattled him. Every snapping twig sounded like the blade returning to him. He roamed the halls of Whitlock Manor, a shadow of himself, haunted not by Eliza's face, but by the silence she left behind. That silence had grown teeth, sharp enough to bite through pride, cruelty, and fear alike. Whitlock Manor itself seemed to absorb her presence. Doors groaned when she was near, though she had vanished. Floors creaked under weightless feet, and windows rattled in absence. Servants who survived the night whispered that the house had become a tomb and a sanctuary, that blood and silence had carved a legend into its walls. Travelers along the river swore they saw a pale figure standing at the edge of the swamp at dusk, staring with eyes that held storms and centuries of sorrow. The story of Eliza spread like ash carried on the wind. It transformed with every telling, a tale of vengeance, of justice, of fear. Each recounting painted her differently, a ghost, a witch, a martyr, a hero. But every version carried the same truth. Silence can speak louder than words, and blood can write a legend stronger than law. Even now, when the delta winds howl through the cypress, rattling shutters and bending branches, the name Eliza carries weight. Some swear they can hear her steps trailing the fog, faint as a whisper, precise as a heartbeat. Others say her gaze lingers on the living, measuring the cruelty of their souls. She is everywhere and nowhere, both vanished and eternal. And so the legend remains, unfinished, unresolved. Whitlock Plantation endures, but the silence of Eliza stretches farther than its walls, sharper than any blade, colder than any grave. When the wind rises and the shadows lean long over the fields, the story comes again, of a girl who bore injustice in silence and became a myth that will not die.